Good afternoon. I'm Brian Katsoulis. I'm the interim vice president of policy and a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. I want to thank you all for coming. And before I introduce our moderator, I wanted to introduce the Middle East Institute and thank you all for being here. The Middle East Institute has been around for more than 75 years, founded in 1946. And our mission is to increase knowledge and understanding between people of the Middle East and the United States by providing high-quality political analysis about what's going on in the region. And that's what this event and this report is about. I should say at this moment of war and conflict and death and destruction in the Middle East, I'm proud to have many colleagues who are right in the middle of it. Paul Salem, our former president and now vice president for external outreach in the region, is in Lebanon right now. Nimrod Goren, our senior fellow for Israel, is in Jerusalem. So we have people in the thick of it whose lives are directly affected by the situation. And it's a very real and I think difficult circumstance for so many people. In addition to sort of these difficult policy questions, and part of our mission is also to feature all the good that's happening even at a time of war and death and destruction. So we have an arts and culture program, and you saw an aspect of it perhaps on the way in our art gallery. If you've not had a chance to look at this wonderful exhibition of photographs from women and by women from the region, from Iran and other places, please spend a moment doing that. Our colleague Kate Seeley, I was just talking with her right before this, is in Riyadh, and she's actually part of a cultural diplomacy effort that we have that has brought U.S. authors to a major book festival, including Walter Isaacson and Fareed Zakaria these days. So while we deal with some tough issues, and we'll talk about them today, we're also trying to highlight the human aspect and the human connection and the connection that America has with the people of the region. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the panel over to my friend and our moderator, Rana Abtar, and she'll introduce the panel. You're going to hear a little bit from me, I think, in the rest of this program, but we're going to have a discussion that she'll moderate, and then we'll draw all of you in. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you for organizing this timely event. Of course, given the rapid developments in the Middle East, I cannot think of a more fitting time to discuss this important topic with our distinguished panel here. So I will start by introducing our panelists. We have here Ambassador Eric Edelman. He is counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He is also the former Undersecretary for Defense for Policy. He also served as ambassador for Turkey, Finland, under both Clinton and Bush's administrations. And he is also now vice chair of the National Defense Strategy Commission. Thank you for joining us. Mara, you are also on the same commission. You are a distinguished professor at the Miller Center and the former deputy assistant to the president for national security affairs in the Obama and Clinton administrations. You also were former deputy envoy for the office of the special envoy for Middle East. Thank you for joining us. And we have also with us Patricia Kayam. Patricia is the senior policy advisor on Iran at Freedom House and senior advisor to the American Task Force on Lebanon and senior advisor here at the Middle East Institute. Did I miss anything? All right. And of course, Brian Katsoulis, he is the senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Middle East Institute, who has also published multiple studies about this topic that we will be discussing today. And we will be talking about your report, Brian. So thank you all for being with us today. We are all watching the events unfold in the Middle East. Today, we are not only talking about the situation in Gaza after the October 7 attacks. There's also Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and today also Iran. We are discussing the U.S. policy in the region through the comprehensive report that Brian and his team prepared. It is the third report of a series, started in April or 4th. How many? So you have April, July.
And then one right before the war started that looked at Biden's approach in the first 2.5 years.
Okay, so you started before and then we are here. So Brian, I know you have 6 objectives that you lined up for the administration policy bullet points. I like that.
Yeah.
But also what was unique about this is that you graded these objectives.
Right.
And I can tell you that if my kids came back home with these grades going down, I'll be called to the principal's office, right?
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Well, thanks, Rana. And first, just briefly, and we'll make this a conversation. What is this report? First, it's the product, as you mentioned briefly, of a team effort. I'm the author. I'm responsible for the analysis. MEI does not take institutional positions. If you look at our scholars on same topics, sometimes we have many different perspectives, and we welcome that. We're not an advocacy institute. But it's the product of a team effort that, in particular, my dear colleague, Athena Mastoff, sitting back there, has done a lot of the research day in and day out in helping inform this process, and then the feedback in peer review efforts. And not all of my colleagues will agree with sort of the final judgment, and that's okay, right?
Yeah.
Believe it or not, disagreement is good and differences of views. Second, it's an analytic framework. The grades, even the categories, you can dispute it. But at a time when there's so much advocacy and pushes for different views, it was an attempt to actually offer some sort of framework and an assessment of what I thought the Biden administration's goals were as stated in word, but also in deed and action, and then give them some sort of attempt at a clinical assessment, as hard as that is in this day and age. So bottom line, in the top line of the report, the title of it is called Strategic Drift, which some may think is a little unfair. But as I see it, the Biden team is in a reactive crisis management approach of its own making. That if there's a dominant approach, which I think is not just in the Middle East, but also you see it in the Ukraine theater, a little bit also in Asia, is something I've called, and other pieces, self-deterrence, that the U.S. Is trying to hold back and not really shape, but rather react to events. This particular report, and I'll close briefly here, it does have the grades. Elliot, you can take a look, and yes, there are 3 grades. The previous report didn't have sort of a grade. And the attempt is just here to focus. I'm not going to go through each of the grades, is to try to focus the minds and my own assessment on how I would grade them. And I rank ordered them in terms of how I thought the administration both prioritized in word, but also in what it did. And certainly Israel's self-defense continues to be a consistent top-line priority. And one of the key things we tease out in this report and previous ones is that when you're trying to navigate this from a strategic perspective in an administration, some of those priorities quite clearly are in tension with others, especially in the tactics in trying to move forward and all of this. And that's the essence of trying to do, I think, strategy and policy implementation, but it's also trying to analyze things not from a particular perspective, whether it's pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian. And hopefully we'll talk about this. What's funny about the grades is that in a previous report, that was the thing that U.S. officials focused on more, because it does focus the minds.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think so. And my friend Mara probably, I know, disagrees with some of this, and that's okay. Again, that's the point, is it's sort of like a theme to actually focus a discussion rather than and try to make it a little bit more analytic and strategic. And the last thing I'd say about this latest report, which you have a copy of, is that if there were 2 top priorities in the July to September period, because that's what this report covers, for U.S. policy, it was to secure a ceasefire and a hostage deal and to prevent a regional war. And you can argue whether that was the case, but when President Biden came out at the end of May with a 3-phase plan to end the war and ceasefire, that clearly, I think, set into motion a lot of diplomacy and efforts to achieve that. They didn't achieve it. I think it was mostly because you have 2 combatants in the Gaza war, Israel and Hamas, that actually see this as an existential struggle for themselves. You have leaders in both of these combatants that essentially see that their own power is directly tied to how this war ends in a clear sense. And that makes it extremely complicated, to be fair, right? And it's hard to sort of even assess, as my friend, I think Dan Arbel's here, highlighted, that you're sort of giving them tougher grades because the situation is actually much more complicated because of the actions of those in the region. But that's the attempt here. Happy to talk about sort of details of it, have the conversation, but more importantly also the recommendations at the end, the 4 or 5 things I would suggest to the Biden administration in its last months in office, but I think more importantly to whomever wins this election and who comes in January.
Definitely. It's a complex times and a complex region as well, Brian. And here it's going to be also, this is a conversation, right? Because we're trying to understand what can be done to resolve this complex situation. And maybe I'll start with one word that we've been hearing a lot here in Washington. The policy of the Biden's administration has been reactive. Do you agree, Ambassador?
I do agree. First, want to thank you for moderating this discussion, and Brian, thank you for inviting me to join here. I'm thrilled to be sitting appropriately to Mara's right, since she and I have been colleagues on the National Defense Strategy Commission, where she was a tremendous colleague. We're also colleagues at the Miller Center, by the way, with that. Yes, and I largely agree with the thrust of Brian's really excellent 3 reports, and now one forthcoming. Although after I left government, I taught for 14 years at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I thought it was a pretty tough grader, but I think Brian's grades might be a little on the harsh side, and I find that surprising since I've been, a consistent critic of the Biden administrations. I largely agree with the thrust of Brian's reports, which is to say that the administration came in with a desire, as several previous administrations had, to limit U.S. liabilities in this region and to divert resources, particularly defense resources, away from the Middle East and towards more areas of the world they thought were more pressing, notably including the Indo-Pacific. And that as a result, there's been a lot of hedging behavior in the region, a lot of self-help, and that the administration has been playing catch-up. I would add, and I think Brian agrees with this, I'll be interested if he does, that the incoming administration brought with it a lot of, I would say, biases inherited from the time in office of the Obama administration, including that the priority in the region should be getting back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, putting a primary emphasis on that, punishing the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which had plenty to make one concerned about, but reflected, I think, a lack of appreciation of the major geostrategic question that has roiled the region for a decade now, which is Iran's, you can call it what you will, struggle for mastery, contest for supremacy, but desire to make itself the hegemonic power in the region. And I think the administration has slow to adjust to, among other things, the Abraham Accords, to the what was going to be the ongoing importance of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, particularly in energy, and other things that Brian has highlighted. And as a result, compounded by the kind of shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan, which Brian does talk about a lot in his report, I think the administration has found itself reacting to events rather than being able to control events, in part because almost every actor in the region sees the U.S. as a power in retrograde, leaving the region, and therefore less powerful and important than it once was.
Sorry for the interruption there. I don't know who let the dogs out, but silence your
So, of course, Brian, I want to hear what you think about what the ambassador said. But Mara, to ask you about also what the ambassador mentioned, that a lot also of people, ex-officials, don't understand why the Biden administration, when the president started in the White House, he did not focus on the Middle East. And but President Biden is not new to the foreign policy scene. He's been in the Senate. He works in the foreign policy files a lot. Why do you think that happened?
Thanks, Bayfran. That's a good question. And I thought about it some. I also really appreciate being able to be here, I should say, or with everyone, and particularly to hear what you have to say, as well. And from the work that Eric and I did together, and I want to come back to that, for the National Defense Strategy Commission, I think I'm not surprised that that's how the Biden administration started out. And regardless of the years of the decades of experience that President Biden had in the region, I think the sense that you see you come in and you see overwhelming challenges. The national security strategy for President Trump and for President Biden were quite similar in pointing out, as were the national defense strategies, and Eric had served on several previous commissions as well, in pointing out China as a pacing competitor and Russia, I would say, as a chronic challenger, challenger threat to the United States. The misperception is, and it's the opposite of reactive, that you can come in and lead an administration and control events. So that your plan for the world, you can say, and we've had several presidents now who have said China is our top priority, have made the mistake of saying we need to pivot to Asia. You can both believe that China is the top priority for the U.S. to have a strategy about, and at the same time recognize it has to be a global strategy. Because guess what? China and Russia are playing an international game. They're not exiting from different regions. They're not diminishing the resources they're putting in, and I'm not talking here just about military, right? They look at all elements of the power they have. And so it is a natural thing that folks in the region then started hedging, started looking at who was around, who was aggressive. And I think it's a particularly American hubris that does not have party affiliation and is kind of surprisingly unrelated to your years of experience in the field, that you think that if you're the United States, you can control what happens in the rest of the world. I would also say, though, that's echoed by the rest of the world, with the number of references to the United States imposing its will on country X, Y, or Z, so that it feeds into, it's a self-perpetuating myth that gets policymakers into a lot of trouble, and I think has us keep repeating the same mistakes. I also think it leads, inevitably, to reactive behavior, because if your strategic focus at the front end doesn't take into account the realities of the world you're operating in, it can't last for much more than being placed on a bookshelf. And Brian and I both worked, had the good fortune, I would say, to work for Sandy Berger when he was National Security Advisor, and he handed out 10 rules that he expected everyone on staff to abide by and recognize. And one was never let the urgent overtake the important. And that happens constantly, and it's gotten much worse since the Clinton administration time, because you're in a 24-hour cycle. And you have a limited number of people, much as the National Security Council staff may have expanded over the years, and I don't think that's a good idea. And you still have one National Security Advisor. You have one president. You have one Secretary of State. And the bandwidth and what's expected to be done within that bandwidth is finite. And the demands of the world are not. So I think that's part of what puts us into a very reactive cycle. And to me, that also explains the hubris, which is not unique to this administration. It goes to part of my issue with Brian and his grades, because I really think that they're not just tough but unfair in terms of what the reality.
All of them, or
all across the board. And Brian, this is not a secret. We talked about this. But at the same time, I very much agree with his recommendation, right? I'm very focused on what can you do to move forward in a way that that addresses these issues more effectively. And I think it starts from, and a lot of, I will plug the recommendations that the National Defense Strategy Commission made, which is about how you use all elements of national power and in what ways you do that, and requires a very integrated look at the world. And it troubles me how many people there are in both parties who still think that somehow, if China is our top challenge as a country, that means all of our resources need to be in the Indo-Pacific, and that's going to protect us. And so I think the recommendations that Brian makes about what's required in the Middle East region very much serve the U.S. national interest. I just think I would like to be focused on how can we maximally encourage and set up the next administration, whoever wins this election, for success and for the ability to implement.
So basically, what I'm hearing, Mara, is that not with this administration. We are not looking at any resolution before, January?
first of all, I don't think you can ever give up on anything. And the president is the president until January 21st. And I worked for President Clinton, who literally, and specifically on the Middle East, up until his last 48 hours in office, was still pursuing every option possible. And I'd also commend people going back to look at President Clinton's speech at the Israel Policy Forum in January of 2001. I believe it was like a couple weeks into January, and the parameters he laid out and the narrative he laid out for framing what it would take to get there. Read that and compare it to Brian's recommendations and see how close it was. And one of the things that he said in after one of the last calls he had with Prime Minister Barak and with Arafat was that he saw how upset people in the room were, how troubling the conversations were. This was a couple days before the end of the administration. And he said the real tragedy is that thousands and thousands of people are going to die. But at some point, and I talked to him recently, he didn't think it was this long. At some point, people will come back to this, to where we started, and it's just going to be after so much more damage.
You gave us a lot to discuss, of course, because it's as Brian said, such a complex topic. And one point that you mentioned that Brian has in his report as well that is very important is, I'm quoting here, the Biden administration made some of the same mistakes previous U.S. administrations have made on other foreign policy issues, trying to do too many things at once without putting enough resources into the overall effort in order to achieve success. And to you here, Patricia, when you read the report, what are the flaws that you saw in the administration policy?
And in my report too, and in me personally too. You can,
No, that we don't have a lot of time.
Well, I mean, before I get into what some of the issues are, in my opinion, not issues with Brian's report, but in general, and I do agree with there's one of the key recommendations, which was that about the lack of a strategic approach and rationale for engagement, which has meant more less sustained and reliable engagement. But one can't help but take a step back and look at what's happening right now. And we have, Israel, which is the U.S.'s ally, which is engaged in a ground incursion in Lebanon. And after a year of war, there is a new strategic reality here, and one that seems to signal that the U.S. is even somewhat powerless. And again, I throw this out provocatively so that we can follow up and maybe discuss this, to rein in sort of its ally, or is it? I mean, or to influence other major belligerents in what's now a regional escalation, what's reaching the point of regional crisis. And we've seen sort of this pattern of impotency, possibly American impotency and Israeli defiance that has played out since October 7th, and which has made the administration appear more like a spectator than a player. Despite the fact that we've seen this grueling shuttle diplomacy happen, but producing very little, on pushing a ceasefire that it seems neither Netanyahu nor Hamas wants. And now it's looking, though, I don't know, miracles could happen before January, that, this administration will leave the White House with a raging war in the region, So, I mean, I think a number of factors, we could think about some that were mentioned in terms of this lack of strategic approach. Maybe the culmination is what's happening now, and maybe we can discuss whether that makes sense or not. I think it was already mentioned, this withdrawal from Afghanistan to begin with was really viewed as a game changer, I think, in terms of the U.S. presence in the region. And I think since then, in particular, the Gulf countries have really raised doubts and taken matters in their own hands, as you pointed out, about the U.S.'s willingness to stand up and deter threats to their stability, I guess, or in particular the ruling families. And so it seemed that Washington was signaling its intention to avoid risks of being entrapped in regional conflict where there aren't direct U.S. interests at stake and where there are no defined exit strategies. And so now, there was a certain struggle to adapt to this idea of the U.S. pivoting away after a long time being the security guarantee. I think that's one. I think, again, going back to since the Hamas-led attacks on Israel, this perception of the U.S. refusing to leverage its influence over Israel to rein it in has had a negative effect and maybe contributed to more anti-Americanism in the region and a crisis of confidence. And can I continue, or do you want to?
Yeah. Leverage is basically, we will discuss leverage because a lot are saying at this point it's too late.
Well, there's a question about that I'm sure the other panelists will have some issue, But I think there's also a failure, and this is something, MEI has been working on, and I'm editorializing here. In my opinion, there's a failure of U.S.-Iran policy, which in some ways, and that's my own kind of perception, there was so much of an intent on engagement, and we can again discuss this, that the range of tools available to the administration were not kind of put to use, for lack of a better word.
You mean sanctions?
Well, Iran is subject to the most comprehensive sanctions architecture, but enforcement has been lacking. But put it aside, enforcement that could also have put pressure on Russia and China, who have roles in this evasion, but with implications on other conflicts like Ukraine and otherwise, which are prime goals of U.S. foreign policy. So, and more importantly, and I have two more things to say in this regard that I care about. More importantly is the role of proxies. And again, the approach, some may argue that today's conflict is about a more compartmentalized, inconsistent, or short-sighted kind of policy towards Iran that has didn't focus on so much on the destabilizing influence of proxies in the region. And we've seen the Houthis consolidate their presence. We've seen, of course, Bashar al-Assad. I'm old. We've seen Hezbollah become the most powerful actor until now in Lebanon. And so, again, there's an opportunity there to shift gears on Iran and through a new strategy. But before I end, I do want to talk about also when Biden took office, he also talked about restoring the U.S.'s role as an advocate of democratic change around the world, including in the Middle East. But, there seems to have been then a preference or a prioritization of stability over any sort of managed change, which has really narrowed kind of U.S. engagement in certain places where they could have had more of a principled kind of engagement, and inevitably strengthened autocracies and autocrats, which I think is one of a challenge that needs to be sort of considered and needs to be taken into account in a re-examination of U.S. foreign policy in the future.
So definitely a lot of elements, and Brian, most of these elements are in your report.
Yeah.
And maybe we talk a little bit about the language of the Biden administration regarding the ceasefire, for example, right?
Sure. Yeah. Look, Biden, I think, and I said this earlier in my remarks, I think the last 3 or 4 months spent a lot of effort trying to get to a ceasefire between the parties, Israel and Hamas first, and then if you saw what happened closely last week, working with many of our regional partners to try to propose this. They did propose a 21-day ceasefire on the Hezbollah front. And my assessment at the time was that the odds of that succeeding were probably quite low, because if diplomacy is not matched with the actions, interests, and security threats that some of our partners face, then that diplomacy is likely to fall short. And if there's one thrust, there's a lot of criticisms and hopefully viewed as constructive in this report on their actions. One thrust is that the irony that this administration that has used as its slogan, putting diplomacy first and working with partners. And it's done so in Europe and in Asia. You've got the Quad, you've got a reinvigorated approach with NATO. It really hasn't done that much in a consistent strategic way with Middle East partners.
Why do you think?
I think it relates to some of the things, actually, and I'll try to respond to things that Eric and Mara and Patricia said briefly. Eric, I think you're spot on that the Biden team came in, and a lot of it had overlap with the Obama administration's team, and they had sort of an operating system, a way of thinking about that part of the world that was formed in how they performed in 8 years under Obama, but also in exile under Trump. And a lot of what had happened in the Trump administration, and I was part of it, Mara was too a little bit when we were at the Center for American Progress, is there's a certain discourse that develops about the Middle East, about other policy issues. And if Patricia's and you are quite familiar with sectarianism and ethnic divides and things like this, we have our own tribalism here when it comes to foreign policy. And these issues being very much, so I think, yes, that template was used. And like Eric had said before, there was a certain approach, especially in the first year of the Biden administration of, well, we don't want to so deeply engage with the Saudis and others, right? But the thing, and one of the earlier reports I wrote about this, that really drove them to engage more in the Middle East in 2022 when President Biden went, and in 2023, were external events. It was the Ukraine war, that Russia invaded Ukraine, price of oil and food goes up. People in the White House say, President Biden, we got to really have more stable relations in the region. Episode 2, spring of 23, China brokers a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. People say, wait, and they've said this publicly, the Biden team, we don't want countries like Saudi Arabia to be more in China's orbit than America's orbit 20 years from now. So let's engage in these efforts more deeply. And that's what they were poised to do. I think another sort of critical lack of in diplomatic engagement, though, was the not prioritizing Palestine and the Palestinian question pre-10-7 in a discussion about Israel-Saudi normalization. And again, 2020 hindsight is easy. It's easy for me to sit here at a think tank and say Jake Sullivan said a year ago that the Middle East is quieter than it's been for 2 decades, right? But many administrations have made this mistake. Mission accomplished, George W. Bush, a few months into Iraq, birth pangs in new Middle East in 2006 as well. All of these things, it's easy to look back and just criticize. Like Mara said, let's move forward. And my main move forward is the partnerships that America has with Jordan, with Egypt, with some of the Arab Gulf states. We actually need to engage more deeply with them to have a collective action front on diplomacy, as well as the security, which I think our CENTCOM is doing, and we're lucky here at MEI to have many of the former CENTCOM commanders as fellows here. Joe Votel, Frank McKenzie, we travel the region with them, but we need a similar counterpart on the diplomatic front. And I don't think that's been actualized in any administration recently.
The problem,
Could I just a couple of observations, both on sort of picking up on some of what Brian has said and going back to Patricia's comments. One observation, it seems to me, and this is something that I don't think really, Brian, you kind of get at in your reports, but I'd be interested in your reaction, which is, part of what went wrong, as Patricia was saying, in the Biden-Iran policy was a continuation to some degree of, I think, a dysfunction we saw in the Obama policy, which was the idea that you could somehow hive off the nuclear portfolio and negotiate a nuclear agreement and not pay any attention to everything else Iran was doing in the region, notably including the proxies.
And the ballistic missile.
And the missile,
Yeah.
In fact, I mean, the ballistic missile element is about to expire, in the UN Security Council. And we're now seeing exactly how important all that is. So there was a kind of continuation, I think, of a mistaken sort of approach, compounded by the fact that, to Patricia's point, when it became clear that there was no way forward, I mean, Rob Malley testified about 2 years ago in front of the Congress that there's no military solution, there's only a diplomatic solution, but there was clearly no diplomatic solution on offer.
Yes.
So what was Plan B? And there never really was, a Plan B. So let me just take that point. Second point is on the issue of leverage, and Mara, I think I think this will resonate with her. We never have as much leverage with allies as people think we do, and there's a reason for that, because as all of them will tell you, you may think X or Y, but in the end of the day, you're going to go home, and we still have to live here in this neighborhood. And as a result of that, it is very difficult to actually, execute the balance between sufficiently giving, allies a sense that we're with them, that we're going to be there to protect them, if in extremis, but that there are limits to, how much we're willing to protect them. It's a very, very difficult balance to walk. And it's one reason why I'm a little bit of an easier grader than Brian, despite my criticisms of the administration.
So I would like us to cover a couple more elements before. So it's a lot, as I said, to discuss. Maybe we pick up on the Iran issue a little bit. The news, everything in the news today, when you look at what's going on, the containment that Brian mentioned in the report, it might not happen with Iran, right? Now we're waiting for a reaction from Israel to the strikes yesterday. Mara, do you think this will go out of control?
I would never answer yes to that, honestly, because I think that part of the job, and this also goes to the critical nature of the administration in its last 4 months, and why you have to be working every day, because it is, I don't want to violate what I just said about the United States can't control everything, but it is a key part of U.S. leadership to do everything possible to ensure it doesn't get out of control, doesn't go out of control.
So you don't see it today as out of control?
I see us as balanced on a very sharp edge, but I also think that the answers for this period of time, and Eric and I were talking about this a little bit beforehand, so I'm curious on his take on this. It's not self-evident what the smartest thing to do for U.S. national security and world security and stability is, and whether that involves fewer or more kinetic action. And that's a very frightening thing for me to say, given the number of factors that are at risk and the kinds of, and what's within your control and what's not within your control for any government leader at this point.
Yeah.
But there's no question that the dynamics in the region have shifted in very real ways over the last 2 or 3 weeks. The kinds of threats that Hezbollah pose, thank you, are less and different than they were. Israel and a ground operation in Lebanon, it's hard for me to see an extended ground operation as being in Israel's interests, given the challenges they've had in the past. Iran's nuclear program has gotten to an extraordinary place, and we are seeing in real time just the difference in dynamics it would pose, or it will pose, to the region and the world if Iran actually has nuclear weapon capability. And so you've got to look at all of those facts, and I'm glad I'm not in the White House right now having to grapple with that, but they are every minute of every day. And so for all of us, I would not try to assume that the ways that you always thought about what would keep things from getting worse necessarily apply over the next couple months. But it is a challenging time, and I would say on this, it's also good that one thing I think the Biden administration has been very strong on is how the re-strengthening of friends and allies, appreciating that there's more they could have done in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The fact that, and this goes to President Biden's experience, that he has so many direct personal relationships that he can call on, and that there's some degree of personal trust there. Which, because what I would take issue with, I don't think that the United States is powerless at all. I think recognizing the United States' power and the limits of it is different than assuming that because the United States can't impose its will, that means.
I think it's the misperception, let's say, about the use of the word leverage too. And I hear it from a lot of people in the Middle East, The question is that keep repeating itself. Why isn't the Biden administration using its leverage, stopping weapons? But also, on the other hand, a lot are saying that this will not stop Netanyahu. Because for him, it's an existential threat today on both levels. The government,
Yeah.
So, Patricia,
Just to respond very quickly, because it's interesting, I'd be interested to hear your perspective. And I'll put it aside and maybe want to respond to it later, but this question of, do you think that at this juncture, and we might divert a little bit, there is a divergence of interests between the U.S. and Israel? And just park that for a while, right? I do want to say from the perspective of Iran, just a couple of points. I do agree with you in terms of the U.S. is, doing everything it can from what I can see, and I'm not an insider, in terms of de-escalating and making sure this doesn't spiral out of control from what I've heard and seen and from what I gather. Iran itself, has messaged before this attack that, really, and what we've discussed internally at MEI is this issue that the survival of the regime is at stake. The first thing they did after the hit on Hassan Nasrallah is they moved the supreme leader, and so they've messaged that they're not interested in escalating at this point, that a response may come, but it will come from Hezbollah most likely. Unclear, right? So I don't think fundamentally that the regime is interested in escalating, and it's said that this was a trap from Israel, but the calculus may have changed now with the response. It may have been pushed in a corner, right? So that was kind of inevitable in some ways. I do want to say, to add to that, like on the Lebanon front, I did come from a meeting at the State Department before where the sort of senior officials are gathering experts to sort of brainstorm, what's going on and what can be done. So this sort of what is the word that I'm looking for? Emphasize what you have said before, that really they're looking at every way, including the negative impact that the Israeli incursion would have, and they're perfectly cognizant that like the ground invasion may really backfire in some ways given what it means,
but
to the Lebanese.
But there's a lot of reports also that the White House gave the green light for this operation.
There's not a green light, or there's not like a green light, yellow light, red light.
But there was a red light with the Obama administration, right?
No,
he said
it doesn't exist that way. It really doesn't.
I think it's about the language. I think, and I'm just talking about from what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Right. It's about the language that sometimes the administration use. Why say there's a red line if you're not?
I think President Obama saying that was highly problematic, wasn't it?
Okay, yeah.
And not a mistake to be repeated.
So when Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, issued a statement after the the Israeli operation, he mentioned also something that the U.S. agrees that the Hezbollah they need to be dismantled. How do you read that, Mara? Like when you read a statement like that and then you hear ceasefire from the White House, how do you explain that?
Well, two things. One, on the ceasefire, I think some of the challenges inside the White House have been not doing accurate reads for whatever reason of what they're told and then how much they publicly put out. Mm-hmm. So, and I think we've seen that a few different times, like that they think they have a deal and they don't. And so to me, that shows more that there's some internal issues in who they're talking to, what they're being told, and then why they decide to put it out publicly. And so I think that's a challenge which I would describe as like operational and technical and tactical. I'm curious on Eric's take on your question, but I would just say my quick take on I do think the United States and Israel are very closely allied in terms of interest in countering Iran. I have zero question about that. And that's where I think the dynamics of how to best do that. I think the challenge on the United States and Israel alignment, particularly given Netanyahu and what it takes for him to remain as prime minister in a line with fundamentalist, extremist, I could use even more horrible words for the 2 or 3 ministers in his coalition that are keeping him in power. I think means that the strategic interest of the United States is clearly in getting a pathway to a Palestinian state. And I think most Americans are certainly in government and many outside believe that it's in Israel's strategic interest as well. But the current leadership of Israel does not see it that way. And so I think, and so for the United States, how those two things tie together, and you can see that in the Saudi, in discussions with Saudis. And I think that's where the rub is right now.
You know, this whole conversation is giving me a bad case of PTSD.
Is it Iraq? Is it?
It's Lebanon. I mean, I'm old enough to have been George Shultz's special assistant in 1982. Wow. So 42 years ago this month, I was the person who woke him up in the middle of the night to tell him that we had over 200 Marines killed in the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut. And so, you know, I've watched, you know, what Mara was talking about, you know, several times, but I do think we need to sort of go back to sort of some basics that get lost in the conversation. So, I mean, because I also lived through the 2006 war when I was Under Secretary of Defense, and I was in the White House shortly after the Israelis withdrew from Lebanon in 2000. So I watched a lot of this all details. Under the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which ended the 2006 war, Hezbollah was supposed to withdraw north of the Litani and with all of its heavy equipment. That has never happened. It has never happened because UNIFIL, which was the instrument that was essentially going to monitor all this, has been unable to do it. They're just incapable of making that happen. The result has been what we've seen since October 7th last year, which is constant and accelerating attacks across the blue line, shelling, which has resulted in, 60 to 80,000 Israelis being evacuated. Also, people on the other side of the blue line being evacuated as well. So Lebanese are involved in this as well as Israelis. It's not just one-sided. The Israelis, I think, I've got plenty of criticisms of Prime Minister Netanyahu, as Mara knows, but two things can be true. I mean, he can be motivated by, his own desire to avoid accountability for whatever corruption he may or may not be guilty of, trying to keep his government in power, including with these really extremist ministers who populated, but also have an interest in Israel's national security. Both can be true at the same time. I think any prime minister of Israel, whoever it was, whether it was Ehud Olmert or Ehud Barak, would want to do the same thing in terms of getting Israelis back to their homes and get the border quiet in the north. The challenge, I think, is going to be an operation that goes after, as they say they're doing, a limited operation, which, by the way, may be the result of some U.S. leverage. Let's not forget that. To remove the tunnel network, the firing positions, the heavy equipment, push the fighters back across Litani, et cetera. How does that, end?
Yeah.
And then who picks up the responsibility, since it can't, I don't think Israel's prepared to have it be UNIFIL because UNIFIL's failed repeatedly. So who's going to then monitor this? And what makes me nervous is when I hear language saying, because it's true that the balance has shifted, as Mara was saying. I mean, John Sawyers, his former head of MI6, had a very good op-ed in the Financial Times about this precisely. John's a very smart guy with some significant experience in the region, as you know, Brian. What makes me nervous, though, is when you hear Israeli voices saying this is an opportunity to come and remake everything. Nabi Berri is now somehow going to become the spokesperson for, the Shia population. Where have I heard that before? Right. I heard that a lot in the spring of 1982 when I traveled, or 83, when I traveled with George Shultz to sign the May 17th agreement, which was going to lead to the withdrawal of Syria from Lebanon, et cetera. It did happen, but only about 40 years later, 30 years later.
Yeah.
So I worry that there'll be too much, a little bit of overweening ambition or hubris, to go back to Mara's point, that then leads to a prolonged presence that becomes like a Chinese finger trap. You can put your finger in, but very hard pull it in.
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about, Brian, in your report. Also, it's about the day after.
Right.
What's the plan? And there's Gaza, there's Lebanon.
Yeah, and there's planning and discussions have been part of it, some of them, but you really can't have a full day after plan.
Yeah.
It's sort of like discussing how do you do the reconstruction from a Category 5 hurricane while that hurricane's still hitting the shores, but you still got to do it, and you got to work with partners that do this. If I could say two things, and Patricia mentioned this, and we're so lucky to have her now as part of the team as a senior advisor. This report is part of this series of assessing the Biden administration. There's a separate strategic initiative you can find on our website of just depicting what the Harris and Trump statements, and then we saw some things last night from Vance and Waltz in the debate, just laying it out there in our mission of education of what these, and not really evaluating too much what they aim to do. And then we have two other initiatives we're doing this fall. One is on Arab-Israel and this question of, is a state of Palestine and a two-state solution even possible? And if so, how do you unify a collective action support, from the region and around the world to make that possible? And then the fourth one is Iran. And overriding a lot of this and in this discussion, but in this report, is the fact that I think successive administrations, including this one, has not had a multifaceted, holistic approach to Iran. That the nuclear file, I think intentionally from the regime, was we'll talk about the nuclear issues with P5+1, but we're going to not deal with the regional security issues. And I was a supporter of the JCPOA myself, but I also felt that a flaw in the U.S. approach and in that of our allies and partners in the region is they didn't really deal with the effects that Iran was having on regional security in places like Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and now Yemen. And it was quite often brushed to the side and dismissed, and we'll deal with that later. Well, that reckoning, I think, is happening right now. And because, you could go back to the successive efforts. 9 years ago, President Obama inviting all of the Arab leaders to Camp David to talk about this holistic approach, but never was there a full follow-through. I would also put the fault also, despite their label of maximum pressure, the Trump administration really did not have a coherent regional security approach. Trump tweeting, we're going to get out of Syria, and then his team fighting him over that. I characterize sort of also the Trump approach as passive appeasement in the region. When Abqaiq in the fall of 2019 was hit in Saudi Arabia, there was not even a serious discourse inside the Trump administration or from Capitol Hill. I remember a prominent senator who I think is trying to run for Secretary of State in the Harris administration, tweeting blame on the Saudis for getting attacked by Iran, which makes no sense at all. Chris Murphy. And again, this goes back to the tribal mentality of different administrations viewing actual real world events that are more complicated through the lens of our own politics and things like this. And this is the point why we're doing this Iran initiative, to try to create a series of products and ideas that don't try to get into this polarized moment that it is. Because the options on Iran aren't between the two false choices of sounding like Dr. Strangelove or sounding like Iran's lawyer, which I think has been the polar opposites. And there's a really, and especially what we're trying to do at MEI, is we've got to have partners in the region who are with us in Lebanon, as you can talk about in spades, or in Syria, which is complicated these days, but Charles Lister's dealing with that. And then especially the Gulf, because, and this is where I'll close, is that the tone that you hear from Saudis or Emiratis these days about Iran, I actually think presents a huge strategic challenge for Israel and for any incoming administration, because it's nowhere close to what Israel's executing right now in this military campaign. It's very much, wait a second, can't we de-escalate and keep quiet? There's a reason why the Saudis let China take credit for this deal that was brokered in March 2023. They'd like to, it's not because they trust the regime in Tehran, but they'd like to see all of those things that they've seen built up not get destroyed. And there's also a reason why Saudis and others came instantly after that pact to the United States and saying, please, can we have some sort of defense squad? It wasn't because they had trust in what China had brokered with Iran, but it's this pendulum swing and this perception that we are not strategically reliable is actually a big part of the challenge, I think, for the U.S. any administration who comes in next. I don't know.
Yeah, and as Mara was mentioning with the China issue, it's also now we see China in the Middle East, and that's also part of the consequences that we're talking about. Ambassador?
Brian, just as a former senior defense planner, let me just say, to pick up on Brian's point, I do think that the role that CENTCOM has played in first orchestrating the defense of Israel on April 13th, 14th, and the role that the U.S. Bulkley and Cole played yesterday in helping intercept some of these 180 ballistic missiles is an asset for the U.S. in dealing with our friends in the Gulf, and not one that we should gainsay.
No, and what I would say in our debate here, and it's still a debate in this town, is that some, for the last 5 or 7 years, have argued that that presence actually is offensive to Iran and is the thing that causes instability in the region. There were arguments also of, let's defund Iron Dome for Israel after the first Gaza war of the Biden administration. Imagine the scenario today if that actually were executed and if the U.S. pulled back from the region. And that's the challenge here. And I'm not somebody who, I agree with Mara, that we shouldn't overstate how much we can shape and influence events. But then if we have a discourse that comes from certain voices and it's not left-right anymore, but that America does more harm than good in the world, then, if you think the last year has been complicated in the Middle East, you pull back some more, just imagine the chaos that would exist
and
there.
Also understanding the ideology in the region of certain actors, right?
Yeah.
That's the most important part. Like some say that Iran wants to kick the U.S. out of the region because of the ideology. So how do we balance that? But unfortunately, I'm out of time. I don't like to share my questions as a journalist, but I have to do it today. So we need the mic here. Can you just... So please, your name, affiliation when you ask question.
Thank you so much. My name is Mohammed Al-Khalil, Professor of Arabic Studies at New York University in Abu Dhabi. I'm here on research fellowship at just walk away at the NYU, Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for the report and discussions, very enriching, and I pretty much agree. But I will come to this really from somebody who is not just an academic who lived in the region, but someone actually. I'm from Damascus, actually from Eastern Damascus, the ground zero for the Syrian revolution. And just in my experience, I've been for the last 20 years. I've been living in the UAE and working as with NYU even from the beginning. Traveling back to Syria before the Arab Spring. The region, the part that I live in is a poor neighborhood part, really. And I've found it very difficult for me as somebody who's not really rich, just an academic, driving to Damascus and try to live. It was very difficult. I concluded, even at that time, that it was very difficult for a wealthy person to live in a poor neighborhood. And I told my friends even 2009 to leave because things were actually looking bad, even in Damascus. I could see that it was going to collapse. What I wanted to say is that this is a continuation of the Arab Spring, which is what I see it. Is it a continuation? There is what I've seen. I've seen a discussion of the political structure. What Biden administration is doing more like a crisis management is not doing a good job at that. Trump administration tried to really create an agreement between the club of the wealthy. Israel really acted as if the Palestinians didn't exist in that agreement. Yeah.
Who is the question for?
So the question to all of you, what I see, where's the economic, where is the social development of the people? Where is some kind of a plan to give the people a reason to live? Where is the pressure on Israel, especially Netanyahu? Let's actually not on Israel. I know I work with many Israeli colleagues and do not agree with him. But where is the thing that you place that you can actually take away from Iran? And I think this is the reason why Saudi Arabia and the Emirates kind of like withdrew, because they couldn't get Israel to establish or create anything that actually can give the Palestinians some reason to live.
Who would like to answer? I know, Mara, you worked a lot on humanitarian also problems or issues in the Middle East. Would you like to answer that?
Well, this may not be what you want to hear, but I'm a little surprised at your characterization of the Emiratis and the Saudis in a trip I believe I was on with Brian in in 2017.
Oh, yeah.
Around the region. I tried every possible way to get the leaders that we spoke with to care about the Palestinians and to care about what was happening to them and to find ways to make the case, frankly, to the Trump administration at that point about why it was important, why it was in their interest in terms of countering Iran to invest more in various ways. And I know from my prior experience in the Obama administration of the amount of time I spent essentially fundraising or trying to fundraise to match what the U.S. was contributing. And I understand there are all sorts of reasons why there's reticence or discomfort with that. But I found it incredibly disheartening that the Jordanians were the only ones on that trip at that point in 2017, 2018, who were committed to and concerned about and looking to find ways to help Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So I agree with you that all these things need to happen, but I just think we should have a realistic view on the dynamics involved internationally.
Right, but what I would say is that that was accurate then, but this is now, and this is what we're arguing and sort of discussing in right now as a private initiative, but we'll roll out some products on this. And our colleague Khaled Al-Gendi had a event last week on the post-war Gaza situation. And it's this, is that at this moment, especially if there's one thing from this horrific war and wars, it's becoming more wars, is the realization of many of these leaders that you need a state of Palestine, a two-state solution. And that sounds hackneyed or maybe even not possible to some folks. But you see the Saudis, the foreign minister, I think today, putting out a op-ed and things like this and foot-stomping this. And this is the criticism I have in this report, which if you could read carefully, is that I don't think that administration, the current administration, has actually had that discussion with all of our partners beyond the crisis diplomacy of trying to get hostages out and get the immediate ceasefire. It's the action plan that treats them not just as ATMs, because for sure U.S. taxpayers are probably not going to foot the bill for a lot of the reconstruction. And for sure the Israelis said in Gaza they're not, and they have a different action plan. So you need more what some people have called a marshalling plan, not a Marshall Plan, but you need a Marshall that puts it together. And I actually think the U.S. can, with private sector and others, play that role. Mara knows this, she's at USAID and the White House and places like this. Eric's gesturing.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing to add to the comments that Mara and Brian made, which I agree with totally. When you ask the question, why isn't there pressure inside Israel on Netanyahu, it's a great question. But part of the answer is because the Palestinians have had such bad leadership. And that what we need to have in order to activate what could become pressure inside Israel is a Palestinian leadership that Israelis recognize is actually willing to take up a two-state solution and is not just interested in either eliminating Israel or, seeing this as a truce on the route to eliminating Israel. And right now you don't have that. I mean, I haven't been there since 2008, but when I was, there in 2002, 2008, I was stunned by how many Israelis I'd known previously. I started my career there in 1981 in the post-Camp David era. And Israelis who I'd known who had been part of Peace Now, who had been activists, had no interest in a peace deal because of what they saw on the other side after the Second Intifada.
Yeah, but I have a lot of criticism of those Israelis as well in terms of what was actually happening on the ground, how attuned they were. And I'll say also during that period from 2003 or 4 to, that year may be off, but you look at when Salam Fayyad was brought in as finance minister and then ultimately as prime minister.
Yeah.
So no, not the top leadership and, a technocrat or you're not a political leader, but that was a prime opportunity for Israelis. I believe Prime Minister Netanyahu was prime minister also during a good part of that time and started the strategy of dividing between Hamas and the PA. So I totally agree that kind of leadership is needed, but I think we've got to be clear-eyed about the mistakes that have been made by a variety of parties in the past when that leadership is in place.
Yep.
Yeah. Right.
Hi there, Thomas Alberson from the Middle East Institute. So, in Brian's report, and we've heard everywhere that the U.S. supports a two-state solution. Does all the U.S. political leadership actually support a two-state solution? Because if the Trump administration comes in power, I have a good feeling they might not. Two, do you guys actually think a two-state solution is feasible? I've heard a lot of talk about, well, there's a lot of discussion about it. What do you guys actually think? Do you guys actually think a two-state solution is feasible, given the fact that there are 750,000 Israelis that live in the West Bank, given the fact that Gaza is leveled? Can we actually have that discussion? Because the Palestinian-Israeli issue continues to sort of cast this dark shadow of war and conflict over the Middle East. And I don't see very much innovative solution in actually trying to get to that root problem.
Yeah, I'll answer yes. And it's more feasible than a one-state solution, especially after October 7th.
There's no one state.
And there is no one-state solution. It won't be a state in the sort of traditional sense that has its own military, and it's complicated. But all of the energy that's poured into so-called one-state solutions, I understand why it's there, and the slogans of apartheid and other things, I get what that's trying to evoke. As somebody who does policy analysis as opposed to advocacy, I don't know what you do with it, because you actually have people, some of the biggest opponents of a one-state solution I've talked to live actually in the occupied territories, and they want sovereignty, they want a sense of dignity and control over their own lives. So it's a complicated conversation. It's much more difficult every year that it goes by. But what I'm saying about this particular moment is now that you've got even more Arab countries, not just Jordan, not just Egypt, who have deals, but countries that actually are open to a deal with Israel, but now their conditions and their price are much higher. So have that conversation, because especially with those leaders who are trying to assert themselves in the region, in their own political economic models, in trying to shape the region, have the conversation they want to have. And I think there's greater unity and, back to the point of leverage, positive leverage in marshaling that sort of support for an end state. Will it look like anything that we see in Egypt or Jordan? Absolutely not. But this is where we need maximum creativity to actually help define that, because I think we can go chasing waterfalls that sound nice in like academic environments, but I don't know what you do with sort of those ideas that aren't two-state right now in a policy context.
Yeah, and I would just say the importance of understanding why you talk about a pathway, which is that there is a lot of work to be done in the marshalling, both in who's involved and how, and in what a lot of people consider really boring block and tackle of what it means on the ground and in which ways. And the people who do that block and tackle with stuff on the ground are not the people who are out there in public talking about the stuff. And they frankly need to be out of the spotlight to be able to do that with the parties involved. But as someone who is in some of those roles, it is absolutely quite possible. It's incredibly hard, but quite possible. And I think it's the only option. Just on your point, though, on the Trump administration, I would just point, I didn't agree at all with what his two-state proposal was, but his administration had a two-state proposal. And I think anyone coming in, because of the reality that's facing you, recognizes that that's the path.
Right here. Front.
Hi, my name is Ann Rutherford. I'm from Maryland. My question was, do you think that with the Abraham Accords going on, that Hamas took this time to attack because they were feeling irrelevant, because they were being passed over and not relevant anymore? And are they relying then, knowing that they can't beat Israel, that they're relying on pissing off, that the rest of the world is going to be pissed off at what they're doing to overcome Israel?
Look, I used to live and work in Gaza in the West Bank. And when I saw, and I was going to visit there in 2022, and it was scuttled for a variety of complicated reasons. When I saw what unfolded and what still is unfolding in terms of the resources that Hamas dedicated to amassing arms and the forethought that it gave to this operation, this was something that I think vastly predated the Abraham Accords in 2020. took years to sort of get to where they were at in 2023. But I do think that they were motivated in part, and I heard this, my colleague Rhonda Slim runs a Track 2 effort, and one beautiful thing about the Middle East Institute is we go out, as I mentioned, and out into the region. And in May, I was there in Doha with a number of people, including people from Tehran, Gulf Arabs, Palestinians. And the people from Tehran were bragging about how they had put Palestine back on the map. Because look what Hamas has done, and Hamas has evoked this debate in college campuses in America and things like this. And what's interesting, it relates to the point I'm trying to make about the Gulf Arab states, and I'll come back to your point, is that one of the Saudi participants was so vociferously against what the people in Tehran had said, what do you mean you put the state of Palestine back on the map? There's 40,000 people dead. You fired missiles just a few weeks ago across our territory. And she was saying we've got a much more steadier approach, which is trying to help lift up the Palestinian people in the long run. So for sure, I think Hamas was motivated to do this. But I wrote early, and I still stand by the assessment, that it's lost. It's lost, I think, because of what it's done to its own people. It may titillate sort of debates around the world. And I'm alarmed to see not only Hamas and Hezbollah flags being flown in protests here, because I think that's misguided this so-called support for the Palestinian people. But whatever motivated it, it clearly has set off a fire that has exacerbated this situation, and it's the impetus of what we're trying to deal with right now. And I think a challenging question for future U.S. policymakers will be, how do you deal with whatever the remnants of Hamas are in Gaza? Because the notion that you're just going to defeat it militarily, and I know some people are thinking about this in the context of Lebanon today, how do you deal with Hezbollah and co-opt them into security structures and arrangements that actually avoid conflagration? But for sure, I think they were motivated by it. But I don't think in any way does that, I actually think it's interesting, I'll close here, that the Abraham Accords still endure. They're backburnered a lot of some of the initiatives, but the strategic impulse, I think, still, even with this horrific war, is towards regional integration. But it's one that will not succeed in the way that I think Netanyahu's speech to Congress was delusional when he talked about, some sort of, he didn't even talk about, certainly not a Palestinian state, but an Abrahamic coalition. None of these countries are going to sign up without actually putting front and center and centering the Palestinian people in a two-state solution.
So do we still have time? I would like to give also some closing statements, just because so we talked about the problems. Can we talk a little bit about one solution? Like, if you would propose today, what the path forward? I know, just bear with me here. Let's talk about the path forward today. Ceasefire first, then we talk about two-state solution, or can we do both, or what's the plan?
You mean in terms of Gaza or in terms of Lebanon?
That's another question, right?
How do you prioritize?
So can we still talk about both together, or are we separating?
I think we can't anymore talk about both. I mean, with the demise of Hezbollah in Lebanon, I think that is over, right? And effectively, that may have been the objective of the Israeli action. But I do want to, not to dwell, we can talk about this ad nauseum, but I do want to say a few things in terms of maybe lessons learned that hopefully won't spark more discussion because we're at the end of the panel. But a couple of things that I take away, and I hope people agree with me, but this idea that overarching, this idea that the U.S. is kind of retrenchment or whatever they want to call it, offshore balancing or whatever it was, works maybe is in question. That's my first thing I want to throw out. The second is we agree that there needs to be a resolution to the Israeli-Palestine question. That's also something, a pathway, you call it, towards a state. Yeah. We agree there's a need to deal with the destabilizing or to curtail the destabilizing behavior in the region of Iranian proxies. But I also think we didn't talk about something that we still need to keep in mind because, we're now in crisis mode and we have this war that is taking place. And we've forgotten that, there's a new kind of multipolar order that was in the making in the Middle East. one where China is more confident and Russia is also being a spoiler, a big-time spoiler. And both of them are brandishing, because I care about human rights and democracy, more autocratic playbooks at a time when really all these regional players are looking are pushed to pursue their self-interest, for lack of a better word. So this is something that potentially bodes badly for the U.S. For U.S. interests in the region. And so I think I'll end here, that I think there's maybe also something to keep in mind for the U.S., a need to refocus on neutralizing maybe China's quiet dominance and focus a bit on constraining Russia a little bit better, so that it doesn't further disrupt, especially now that Iran is especially in Syria and other places where Iran is not going to have as much influence. And we're left with Russia, which is definitely not a positive player.
So I would actually pick up on last point. I actually think decision makers are focused there. I think it is just late in the game. So my making lemonade out of a lot of lemons is to say that to see things more clearly and to see that part of the national security strategy that the United States needs necessarily involves looking at what China and Russia are doing throughout the world, and the dangers of the United States pulling back anywhere leaves a vacuum that we know there's no question now who's going to fill that vacuum and how various players are acting. So that provides an opportunity for policymakers to both develop a strategy going forward and clear plans for executing. And on that, I would say that much as I disagree with Brian on his grades and the fairness of his grades, I would fully endorse the recommendations he makes as a way of executing on some of what you're talking about.
First of all, I agree with everything Mara just said. I mean, I think the sort of specter that is haunting all of this, to appropriate a term from Marx's Communist Manifesto, which I don't normally quote, but is...
I'm glad I'm not translating this into Arabic.
Is Iran's slow, steady movement towards nuclear latency, which Mara mentioned earlier. This is something that I think is just profoundly dangerous and destabilizing. Again, as Mara said earlier, one can only imagine. I mean, late President Rafsanjani, once said that Israel is a one-bomb country. That's a slight exaggeration, but as magnificent as the sort of performance of the U.S. and Israeli missile defense systems were in April and again yesterday, that all essentially works on algorithms that basically tell you where you need to take a shot and where you don't, because the missile is headed towards either open water or uninhabited territory. You don't have that luxury when nuclear weapons are involved. And so we're coming to a point here where both for Israel, which has been worried about this problem obviously for years, and for the U.S., where we've had, I think 6 last time I counted, U.S. presidents of both parties saying we would not let this happen, whether we're going to let it happen or not. And I think that's hanging over all of this. And we'll see in the next few days, what role that plays.
And I think like a year ago on the Hill, they were saying that 6 months Iran would have a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So just to close on what I would advise, and you can read the recommendations, but I've said this recently. I think today's Middle East, in some ways, I've likened it to the Wild West in America in the 19th century, where there's actually pockets of stability where people are pursuing prosperity and their dreams of gold. And it's actually happening. What's interesting, we mentioned this in the report, is that it's this time of war, but people are still doing investment in business conferences just a few hundred miles away. And I think the U.S. can play an important role diplomatically, I want to highlight, but then also backed by a military security strategy to round up the posse that's needed to have a team effort, because it's not just about the U.S. We should learn the value of partnership, Sharaka, of really building those deeper relationships in the Arab world. And because those countries, and many of them, are executing sort of their own plays, in a big way. And the last thing I'd say is that doing that in concert with this current Israel and Israeli government is extremely hard and probably impossible because of the lack of trust and predictability there. I remember when Ben Gvir, one of the ministers you're talking about, did his walkabout in the Haram al-Sharif. I was talking to a Saudi friend, and he said two things. He said, look, you know, these Israelis never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, which is what Israelis like to say about Palestinians. And then the other thing, which is interesting, it goes to values. He said, you know, you Americans and Israelis said you should told us for years, get rid of your Wahhabis, get rid of your extremists. He said, what are we supposed to do about these Israeli Wahhabis and these extremists? And I actually see that there's still a core sort of centrist, liberal part of Israel that wants to go against. You see them in the streets before this war and during the hostage protests. So the thing I'd say is that for the U.S. to actually round up this posse, you need to actually discard these arguments that say America should restrain itself, offshore balance, and we're more of a problem than the solution. You actually have to deal with the complexities of deeper engagement. And that does not mean military, because post-Iraq and 9/11, the people who oppose the U.S. and call it a colonialist power and things like this just automatically knee-jerk say, you want another war. No, I'm talking about a deeper, more multifaceted engagement with our partners in the region to make life better for the people who live there, as opposed to sort of instrumentalize this region as some sort of geopolitical competition. I'll close there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian, Mr. Ambassador, Mara, Patricia. I guess this is the longest I've been away from my phone. Did the world go on fire? Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.